welcome to the Theology Mill, brought to you by Wipf and Stock Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. In this podcast, we interview some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, philosophy, and more. Many of the folks we talk with on the show are also authors with us at Wipf and Stock, where we have the honor of putting into print a broad swath of work which nourishes the academy and the church. On this episode, I interviewed Dr. Matthew Levering. Dr. Levering holds the James N. Jr. and Mary D. Perry Chair of Theology at Mundelein Seminary and is the author of over 30 books, including his 2019 publication, The Achievement of Hans Urs von Balthasar, an Introduction to His Trilogy. In our conversation, Levering and I discuss Hans Urs von Balthasar, especially as his work relates to Thomism, liberal Catholicism, Ignatian spirituality, modern German philosophy, and much more. So with that, friends, let's jump on over to the interview. Let's start with what impresses you the most about Hans Urs von Balthasar as a theologian.
Well, that's a tough question, but I'm most impressed by the way that he brings in so many of the greatest sources of our faith, but also just sort of has a literary verve. You know, it's really quite amazing to read him. He's he's drawing upon such a wide range of great sources, especially sources prior to the from the first 14 or 15 centuries of the church's existence, but then also a lot of mystical theologians, and then he also draws upon poets and so on. He has an amazing range, really, and a literary verve, and just a deep commitment to following Jesus, and a deep love for Jesus. And I love his sense of mission, where we share. Each Christian has a particular mission that shares in Jesus's fundamental mission of sacrificial love. So there's a lot of incredible things I find in Balthasar. I know we'll talk about those.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So on the other side, because I know you said that you don't agree with everything about von Balthasar. So what's maybe one critique you might make of his project?
Well, I think that his understanding of Christ's cross and of the Trinity is kind of too much. I know that he intends a lot of his language to be metaphorical, to sort of awakening us. He doesn't intend it, I don't think, to be analogical. But on the other hand, for example, on the cross, when he speaks about the cross, he has a very strong substitution doctrine where Jesus endures the wrath of the Father in a profound way, because Jesus really takes on sin in an incredibly profound way. And so the Father pours out his wrath upon sin upon the Son, because the Son, Jesus Christ, is filled with what Balthasar calls the effigies of sin. And so the Son is filled with all sin, and the Father pours out his wrath. To me, this is unacceptable. This is not at all a Catholic understanding of the cross. This is, Balthasar needed to have followed more of the satisfaction doctrine, but he didn't fully understand the depth of the satisfaction doctrine, which is different from substitution doctrine. He didn't fully understand the depth of it, I don't think, at least when he writes about Aquinas's version of an Anselm. He understands partly, but he doesn't understand, in my view, fully. And I don't blame him. Balthasar is trying to enhance the imaginative power of Christianity. He's trying to call to your attention just the imaginative greatness. And so he does the same thing with the Trinity, where he argues, for example, that hell is a Trinitarian event because he says that the Trinitarian persons in their distinction are infinitely distant from each other, and the Father simply sends forth the Son in begetting him in a way that is like an abandonment, so the distance between the divine persons for Balthasar, the distance between the divine persons is infinite, and so that it's infinitely greater than the distance between the most alienated sinner, like Satan, and God Himself. In other words, so you have this Trinitarian distance, and that's why hell is a Trinitarian event in a certain sense, surely a metaphorical sense. Now, Balthasar, what he's trying to do really, though, the bottom line is he's trying to make the Trinity. He's trying to remind you that the Trinity is not just begetting, generation, procession, word, image, love, gift. The Trinity is not just subsistent relations. The Trinity is something incredibly exciting, incredibly dynamic, infinitely dynamic, infinitely active, infinitely personal, and so the personal relations between the divine persons are far more personal than we can imagine, far more profound, far more wondrous than anything that human history has to offer, than anything that imagination can think of. You see, so Balthasar he's trying to capture the intensity, the glory of the Trinity. And so he feels that the medieval scholastic, and therefore the Augustinian and patristic, including the church, all of the Greek church fathers, he feels that their way of approaching the Trinity sort of, in the end, sort of dulled it down, so that we need sort of the mystical insights, the sense of wonder, the sense of amazement. When you think about the Trinity, there's nothing more exciting than the Trinity, and so Balthasar, he works to bring that out. But unfortunately, though, as theologically, though, he in my view, he goes too far. And if he wanted to speak that way, he needed to be very clear that it's very, very clear that he's just speaking in metaphor, because he brings in some very serious problems, along with the excitement. Well, anyway, my view here, I want to be clear. My view is that every theology has a certain set of problems with it. I don't subscribe to the notion that that kind of you have sort of a perfect theology, and then that you have some sort of theologian, whether it's Irenaeus or whoever might, Augustine, who's sort of perfect on everything, and then the rest of the ones are sort of measured. I don't subscribe to that. I think that all theologians have some weaknesses. So I do think Balthasar, his theology has some weaknesses, but in saying that, I want to emphasize that I'm being a Balthasarian, because Balthasar, he's the first to criticize. He criticizes all the great theologians as deficient. So he criticizes Irenaeus in a very sharp way, and Irenaeus is one of his favorite theologians. And he criticizes Augustine in a profoundly sharp way, too sharp. But Augustine over like predestination issues, that type of thing. But he criticizes him. He criticizes all the great theologians, every one of them that you could even think of, he criticizes. And so my point is that Balthasar, he doesn't hesitate to identify other theologians as deficient. He too is deficient. That'd be what I would want to add, I agree with him, but he also celebrates each of these great theologians. He celebrates them and he values them, and so they're part of the symphony. So I like his image of truth as symphonic and his symphonic approach. Now, there is one thing I would add, though, is that he's not very fair to the theologians between say 1560 and 1950. He's not fair to those. It was part of the Ressourcement movement, part of the time. And these guys in seminary, they read a lot of manuals. They didn't like their teachers. Honestly, they didn't like their teachers, and they were kind of fed up and bored with the theological textbooks. But man, you ought to read the theological textbooks that people write now. It's just boring as all heck. So theological textbooks are boring. That's kind of the problem. And so they had the anyway. Balthasar is just, he's too negative about these, often too negative about the theologians preceding him in the post-Tridentine period. But oh well, he wanted to open up space for a different approach, and I value what he has accomplished very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had mentioned earlier how much of a wide range of sources he draws from, right? Theological, philosophical, literary, but also in his writing, he's so prolific and wrote on such a vast array of topics and published just so many books. So and he's not systematic either, is the thing about he's not a systematician. So I guess it can be difficult to trace kind of what are his core themes throughout his whole corpus. So what would you say maybe are some of the unifying threads?
Well, as I see it, the whole thing is unified by the kind of the nation theme from Saint Ignatius Loyola, because Balthasar is really a Jesuit. The nation theme of self-surrender. And so I myself think that Balthasar is a systematician, that of course, all these guys swear that they don't have a system, but I don't believe that, not even for a second. Because look, if you're a theologian, you do have some sort of systematic way that you have in mind that you're going to undertake the task of theology. And Balthasar is very much that kind of theologian. And so what he's doing is he's going to work. And so I argue that he's everything. If in Balthasar, if you have a question, the answer is going to be self-surrender. So no matter what topic you're talking about, whether it's Eucharist or anything else, Eucharist, Trinity, Mary, Jesus Christ, any topic else that you can think of, the answer is going to be self-surrender. But so when Balthasar, by the way, I think that's a very profound answer, because we don't need to think about, self-surrender. It's just simply the going out, the ecstasis, the instead of clinging to self, the pouring oneself out, the going out to the other. Do you see? The love for the goodness of the other. It's just charity. It's a way of describing charity. The love for the goodness of the other, the pouring out, the kind of the liquefying of the self for the other, and so everything about Balthasar really is about that, and that's an incredibly central Christian theme. You couldn't think of a more fundamental Christian theme. Everything is rooted in Jesus Christ. Then, as he sees it, the form of Jesus Christ, the manifestation, the revelation of who God is, the face of God, in the love that is Jesus Christ, the embodied love. Anyway, so for Balthasar, though, what he wants to do, as I see it, is he wants to respond. I argue this in a book that I wrote, so I'm just giving a little preface. But he wants to respond to the great German thinkers who are dominating the culture of our day. And so he's very concerned. He's very concerned that Catholic theology is not responding to the rise of modern culture. The Catholic theology, under the form of neo-scholasticism or even scholasticism, post-Tridentine, is not rising to the level of culture. And so Catholics are no longer seen as leading the intellectual life, as being, Catholic theologians are not even almost like part of the intellectual life of the modern university, or whatever, or the modern culture. Modern culture doesn't have that much of a place, for Christian theological thinking. Remember, he's thinking in Europe of his day, which was rapidly secularizing. So the three key thinkers are Immanuel Kant. He thinks these are the three drivers of modernity, at least in Europe. And the three drivers of modernity are Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and then the third one is Friedrich Nietzsche. And so Balthasar is not a Kantian, he's not a Nietzschean, and he's not a Hegelian. Now, he's closest to Hegel of all three, but he's a very strong critic of Hegel. But he's very much, but so what he's doing in the aesthetics, his glory of the Lord, people, you kind of have to read the neo-scholastic manuals in foundational theology or fundamental theology. Fundamental theology. You read those manuals in fundamental theology, which are essentially apologetics or kind of like the act of faith and so on. And what you're going to realize is that Immanuel Kant is a key figure in those the whole Catholic debates in Catholic fundamental theology in the early 20th century. Because you have guys like Pierre Rousselot writing things like the Eyes of Faith, or you have Maurice Blondel, working through very important things about apologetics, about fundamental theology. And so what's happening is that these great Catholic thinkers are using Kant, but going beyond Kant, as it were. And when they think about apologetics, about natural theology, about proofs of God's existence, about reality, they're going beyond Kant. And you have other guys like Joseph Marechal. This is what's called transcendental Thomism. It's Aquinas, but it's Kant is a key figure. Now, the thing is that Balthasar is no Kantian, and he is not a transcendental Thomist, but he is influenced somewhat by Rousselot, just like Henri de Labarre is very influenced by Rousselot, and Rousselot being very influenced by Kant, and Aquinas. So if you get all that in the background, you're going to see that the aesthetics, where he talks about the glory of the Lord, the manifestation of the Lord, is a very strong response to Kant. Now, Kant, on a number of grounds, Kant has an aesthetics himself. Kant has a vision of the sublime, of the beautiful. Kant has a very, very complex and rich aesthetics, but Kant also has his whole thing about about transcendental apperception and all sorts of things in terms of like what we can know about God. It's all sorts of things that involve fundamental theology, And so for Kant goes out in search of like the grounding of the whole, like the ground of all knowledge, the ground of all knowledge. He wants to what is the ground of all knowing, and Kant searches for that in the transcendental apperception. He searches for it in the mind, in the consciousness, in one's own mind. Now Balthasar also searches for the ground of all knowing, and he finds out. You know what it turns out to be? It turns out to be self-surrender. It turns out to be something Kant had not realized. It goes infinitely beyond Kant, really. It turns out to be the cross. The ground of all reality is the cross. The ground of all reality. Now, you might say, well, that puts evil into the ground of all reality. Well, Balthasar doesn't mean to do that at all. What he's saying is the ground of all reality is ecstasis, or pouring oneself out, or charity, or self-giving, or self-pouring out. Do you see that's what he's up to? The ground of our reality is this infinite pouring out of self, this infinite love for the other, this infinite, you see. And so everything, what Balthasar is showing in The Glory of the Lord, which is 7 volumes, and he shows many things, and he talks about many topics, but the fundamental point that he's trying to say is that the ground of all reality, if you're searching for the ground of all reality, that everything manifests, everything manifests if you dig into everything, what you're going to find is beauty. And what beauty is this self-surrender, or this pouring out, this ecstasis. It's called Christ, the form of beauty. Christ is the form of beauty. And he's in dialogue then with Kant in a very profound way, but in an undercurrent, because Balthasar is no Kantian. In fact, he opposes Kant to Goethe, and very much chooses Goethe, but the thing is that if you understand fundamental theology from that period, you've got to be engaged with Kant, and so Balthasar is in his Glory of the Lord. Now, so that's his first 7 volumes of the trilogy is his Glory of the Lord, and it's very, very important. And I call it a Kantian critique of Kant, but sometimes people misunderstand. They say, "What do you mean Kantian? What do you mean Balthasar is not a Kantian?" And I answer to that, of course he's not a Kantian. He's just taking some elements from Kant, and he's showing how Catholic faith completely outdoes, and the sources of Catholic faith, including Scripture, including the great members of the symphony who understand beauty. He shows how they completely outdo Kant, and so what he's showing then is that one of the pillars of modernity, Immanuel Kant, is instructive in a certain way. And so you got to remember when Balthasar starts writing this book, where Immanuel Kant's books were kept in the library of the Catholic library? They were kept in like a cage, in a under lock and key. Do you understand that? They were kept like under lock and key, at least in a lot of places, because they were on the index. They were heretical. They were dangerous, man. They were dangerous. And Balthasar doesn't deny. He agrees that they're not, these are not, Kant has misunderstood the reality. Balthasar knows that. But he thinks, if Catholics are going to become, if the Catholic faith is going to truly engage, with our time and truly be what it should be in our time, you're going to have to engage with Kant. And so, of course, many others agree with him. Many Catholics of his time agreed with him. But the main point is that Balthasar shows that if you follow Kant, and especially with Kant's search for what he called transcendental apperception, you're going to find, and also then Kant's aesthetics, his aesthetics, which is very complex, as I mentioned, you're going to find that Christianity, that in his view, the Catholic faith, but the form of Jesus Christ, turns out to be the very ground of all reality, which is what you expect, because all things are created in the Word. That's all Balthasar is saying, is that the beauty of reality, at the ground of reality, is this incredible beauty. And what is that beauty? It's the beauty that reflects the Word. And what is the Word? The Word is the Father's pouring himself out. The Word is the being poured out. The Word, the being poured out in love, the goodness of the other. You might call it self-surrender or whatever else Balthasar certainly would, I think. But anyway, so that's kind of the form of all things. That's the beauty of all things. And Balthasar he approaches this from a number of angles in that these amazing 7 volumes. But by no means am I saying that like when Balthasar gets into metaphysics, he's not a Kantian. He gets into he has 2 volumes on metaphysics, the history of metaphysics in the Glory of the Lord, and he's not a Kantian, of course, not at all. But that's not the point. The point is the whole thing of the Glory of the Lord really is aiming at showing kind of the foundation of all things, and that foundation turns out to be Jesus Christ. And so that's the thing. And so remember, Kant himself looks for that. Kant looks for it, but he looks for it in the mind, and so on. Anyway, the thing is that then you have the next set of volumes is essentially working through salvation history, but doing it also through the figures, the great figures of the economy of salvation, such as, well, of course, Jesus, Mary, and then other figures. Balthasar also, he thinks in terms of theater. So this is the theodrama. So now we're turning to the theodrama, and there in the theodrama, it's quite clear that he's trying to benefit from certain elements of Hegel, because Hegel, of course, was tremendously interested in drama. So if you're writing on drama, then you're working with Hegel, because Hegel was a great German philosopher of drama, of theater. And so, and Balthasar, of course, Balthasar, his doctorate was in Germanistics, so that probably inclined him to engage with Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. Anyway, so the point is that Balthasar, when he gets to the kind of like the center of the Christian story, which is like the cross, the Trinity, and when he's doing kind of the mission of the person, you have like Jesus Christ and Mary and the other great figures in the Gospels. So Balthasar's treating all this, and then he goes into eschatology and everything else. The whole story, the whole story from the Gospels of Christ coming, Christ's entrance in the world, Christ's teaching, Christ's cross, Christ's resurrection, ascension, and Christ coming in glory. The kind of this thing. So one of the things that, of course, worried that Balthasar has to engage at that point would be what he calls the dramatic tension. Is like God going to win, or is sin going to win? And because right now, if you look around our world, and in Balthasar's time, with the Holocaust and all the other things, in our time too, sadly, the world is a place of dreadful sin and dreadful chaos. There is some order in the world, but it's sort of a miracle that there's any order. The sin and chaos are so powerful and so destructive, and so there's a clash. There's a real clash between holiness and sin, and of course there's an internal clash, an interior clash. Anyway, so all this is very eschatological. Balthasar is a very eschatological thinker, just as you have to be if you're post Albert Schweitzer. Okay, so Balthasar, he's thinking like this, but he works it out through this engagement with Hegel, and he shows that Hegel has not thought deeply enough. Hegel has not thought deeply enough about Hegel's whole version of history, which is I'm not going to go into Hegel in this discussion because it's too dense. But Hegel's version of history is almost everything is sort of plotted out, and history, it's on kind of a trajectory. In other words, like Hegel knew what history was going to be. Hegel was sort of the pinnacle of history. Hegel kind of, the Hegelian system knows everything. The Hegelian system sort of knows everything and has a place for everything. But Balthasar points out that the Hegelian system doesn't really have a place really for, in a serious way, for the living God, the transcendent God, the God who acts rather than sort of the God who develops. But Balthasar has critiques of Hegel, many critiques of Hegel. Balthasar has a strong critique of Hegel's understanding of the cross. The point of it is, though, is that what Balthasar does, what he finds in Hegel, especially, is that Hegel's, it's kind of, when you read Hegel, it can seem that Hegel's understanding of God and of the cross and of all these things is somehow more exciting, somehow more filled with energy than is kind of the scholastic treatment of the Trinity, or even the Thomistic treatment of the cross. Okay, and so Balthasar outdoes this. He outdoes it. So when you read the Theodrama, you get something so dramatic that you can hardly stand it. It's incredibly dramatic, and there's much power to it. And he shows that. Well, I already talked about some of this in my critique of Balthasar, where I critique some of it. In my view, goes too far, but the main point is that that the Theodrama is out narrating Hegel. It does a lot of other things as well, but he's out narrating Hegel. That's an important aspect. Anyway, now you might say, well, what's the use of out narrating Hegel? Who is Hegel anyway? Well, look, we gotta kind of step back here. Hegel, we got to realize that Marx was a Hegelian. Did Marx have an impact on history? Have you ever read about the arc of history? And Hegel is deeply present in our culture. Hegel is was even more deeply present in Balthasar's culture. But Hegel is very, very deeply present in our culture, in part because Hegel has these offshoots. Marx was a Hegelian, and Marx is deeply present in our culture. But there's also other offshoots coming forth from Hegel. So we would sort of neglect Hegel at our peril. Our intellectual culture is still filled with Hegel. It might not call itself Hegel, but it's related to Hegel. And so anyway, but then you have the third, and the third one is Nietzsche. And if anyone wants to imagine that our culture is not profoundly Nietzschean, then they're crazy. So Nietzsche now Nietzsche though is his own thing, and so the main thing is that for Nietzsche, truth is always the will to power. So truth is always radically contextual. Do you see what I mean? It's always sort of radically contextual, and it's based upon getting something. So if I make a claim of truth, if I claim to know something, I'm just trying to get something. You see, I'm trying to get some power over you. I'm trying to get some power over other people. I'm trying to get something. And so this is a very, very prevalent understanding of truth. It's behind identity politics and all sorts of things. I mean, in other words, it's very prevalent. So Balthasar, I say in his Theologic. Now remember, his Theologic does a number of things. But I say that in his Theologic, what Balthasar is fundamentally doing, though, is he is offering a Nietzschean critique of Nietzsche. But Balthasar is not a Nietzschean. Okay, but his critique, though, of Nietzsche goes along lines that Nietzsche could recognize, and it does so because Balthasar says that what is truth? What is it? Truth is the will to love. Truth is the will to love. So for Balthasar, if you look at truth, ultimately, what is truth? Truth is self-surrender. That's the truth of things. The truth of things is self-surrender, just like the true drama. The true drama is the drama of self-surrender. The self-surrender of the Trinity, the self-surrender of Christ, and the self-surrender of all those who are in Christ. You see, that's the real history. The real drama of history is self-surrender. That's what the real history is. And it turns out that the real truth of things, the lasting truth, the ultimate truth, and the truth of God, the truth that measures everything, is self-surrender. And so it's love, man. It's love. So love is the fundamental thing. And so Balthasar, in this way is like a Bonaventurian, but he's a Jesuit, he's a Ignatian. And so Balthasar, for him, he is a voluntarist of a kind, he emphasizes the will and he emphasizes the good, so you remember, like, what's the highest transcendental? Is the highest transcendental being, or is the highest transcendental the good? Well, Bonaventure says the highest name of God is the good. And we're not talking about names like Yahweh or something like the Tetragrammaton, but Balthasar's, Bonaventure says highest name is the good, and Aquinas says highest name is being, and so there is this, and so Balthasar follows in a Bonaventurian tradition or a Jesuit tradition. And love is the key thing, love, that's the heart of everything. The pouring out of self for the other, the love of the good of the other, the obedience in a sense.
So one of your main goals in your book, The Achievement of Hans Urs von Balthasar, is to reconcile the divisions between Thomistic and, I don't even know if I'm saying this right, but Ressourcement theologians. kind of via von Balthasar's work. So how does Balthasar's trilogy in particular offer potentials for bridging those two camps?
Well, the thing about my perspective is that I think see some of the reviewers of my book misunderstood what I was doing, because they kind of said, "Hey, Balthasar uses Aquinas," so they would say things like, don't you know that in Balthasar's, in his Metaphysics and the Glory of the Lord, Balthasar uses Aquinas at a pivotal place in volume, whatever it is, volume, at the end of volume 4, at the end of, I think it's the end of volume 4. Anyway, the point is that Balthasar uses Aquinas, and Balthasar benefits from Aquinas. And they say, don't you know that? Because I didn't really put that in my book. And so I think they've missed the point. And of course I do know that, and I'm well versed in that, but the point is this, that Balthasarians and Thomas are going to disagree. That's just how it's going to be. And you got to remember that in the Catholics have a lot of schools of theology. So to be a Catholic, you don't have to. You agree upon the creed. You agree upon sort of these basic things. The core definitive teachings of our faith. But you don't have to agree. So you agree about a lot of stuff, the moral life and all sorts of stuff. But you don't agree about how we're going to understand. For example, the cross, or there's different schools of thought about how we understand the incarnation, or different schools of thought about how we understand the Trinity, or different schools of thought about how we understand the causality of the sacraments. So Catholics have always been dealing with a lot of the Catholics have different schools of thought which are in tension with each other. For example, about the Eucharist, that would be, you have different schools of thought there that are in tension. And so you're going to have arguments then. You're going to have arguments. And so the point of my book, though, was that we've had a situation after the Second Vatican Council, where at a certain point after the Second Vatican Council, it appeared that Thomism, that the study of, St. Thomas Aquinas as a living, vibrant theological school, was going to disappear, because what they call Neo-Thomism was completely obliterated, by the council, and the leading figure of at least Dominican Neo-Thomism was a guy named Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, and he was basically treated like, if you're even to read his book, you would be like tainted with, you'd have like a scarlet letter on your chest. So the thing was that the basic idea after the council, at least among some figures, was that from now on, henceforth, we'll have the Ressourcement movement, and that will be, at least in the 1990s, that was sort of led by Balthasarians. You would have the Ressourcement movement, but you wouldn't have any Thomist movement. You would have Ressourcement movement, and then you would have sort of the Catholics who are more in line with Protestant liberalism, and those Catholics identified with Rahner, with Karl, with Skillebeeks, and others. But you can see my point, though, that at a certain stage, the idea was you would have Balthasar, you would have Communio, but you would not have any Thomists ever again. Well, that didn't work. I mean, that was a dumb idea anyway. So, but the idea that Thomists and Balthasarians are going to agree with each other, that's not going to happen. We're dealing here with distinct theological schools. So the point of my book, though, was just a simple one, really, which is that right now the Catholic Church is facing a very strong revival of the theological school associated with what I would consider to be Protestant liberalism. The theological school of Karl Rahner, of Edward Skillebeeks, and so on. And so if you look at most Catholic universities, the theology department or religious studies, would be filled with, kind of contextual theologians of different kinds, liberation theologians of different kinds, whether feminist or queer theory or whatever. And so essentially, Rahner is making a huge comeback, and on all levels of the church, and there's a number of reasons for that, So I don't need to get into reasons here. But what I argue in my book, though, is that theologians who agree, who really are committed to the creed and to the fundamental teachings of Catholic tradition, the teachings that have been handed on about the moral life, the sacramental life, the basic things. Now, we might disagree about like how to understand the sacraments, but we agree, for example, that the sacrament of the Eucharist, really is the real presence of Jesus Christ, or really is the sharing in Christ's cross, his Paschal mystery. Or we agree about these fundamental things, but then we disagree about like how to account for that. So my argument, though, was that theologians who have this fundamental agreement need to learn how to get along, and they need to learn how to get along fast, because if they don't get along pretty soon, they're going to find themselves completely outflanked by the very unified liberal, in the classical religious liberal sense, liberal Catholics. I'm talking about the classical religious liberalism. There's a number of Catholic thinkers who really are following the model of religious liberalism. Oftentimes they don't know they are, because they don't read Protestants. It's kind of a shame, man. But it's a shame. But a lot of they don't read 19th century Protestants, so they have no idea what religious liberalism is. They haven't even read. They don't know what Protestant religious liberal, what it might be. So they actually are religious liberals, and the changes they want to make to the Catholic faith will result in the very same thing that happened within Protestant religious liberal communities. And what happened within Protestant religious liberal communities is that there was a massive loss of faith, and that loss of faith, because look, who's gonna follow Jesus Christ, the crucified Savior, if what it really means is that we can be ethical people or something, but it doesn't really have any fundamental eschatological import or deep, profound. Jesus really didn't really change anything in a deep way or whatever. Okay, so what I was saying then is that Thomists and Balthasarians must take the opportunity to agree not to condemn each other, but to work with each other, even where there are disagreements, and to try to appreciate where, in certain ways, appreciate each other. But by saying appreciate each other, I didn't really mean that now that the Thomists are going to like write a list of all the things they agree with Balthasar about. That's it's kind of like the idea that the Balthasarians are going to write a list of the 7 things that they agree with Thomas Aquinas about. Well, Balthasarians usually respect Thomas Aquinas as a philosopher. They often respect him as a philosopher, but usually they don't follow him as a theologian. Well, that's not going to please Thomists. Thomists are not going to handle it. So my point is, we're not going to sit down and write lists of like the things that we agree about with Balthasar, where Thomists agree with Balthasar, and where the Balthasarians agree with Thomists. To me, that's a fruitless. It may be useful in some way, but ultimately it's fairly fruitless. And so, what I was saying more was that I was just suggesting at the end of my book, The Achievement of Hans Urs von Balthasar, was that we can learn different divergent schools, or different schools within Catholic theology can learn to respect each other's, the achievement of the other, even while disagreeing with even with some important elements. So you can still see that hey, look, if you follow Aquinas, as I generally do, you can still see that Bonaventure makes a major contribution. I mean, I'm trying to give you an example. Or you can see, if you follow the Dominican commentators, you can see that nonetheless the Jesuits are great. The Jesuits are great thinkers, and the Jesuits have a great tradition. You see, that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm saying that you respect the other tradition within the Catholica, but that's the goal in my book. I argue that Balthasar has offered a great achievement. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. It just means that as within the Catholica, you respect the diversity of schools. Whereas for me, it's quite a different matter when we're talking about religious liberalism. To me, religious liberalism is at odds very deeply with Catholicism. And so I would see the Catholic thinkers who advocate religious liberalism as undermining the very ground of Catholic faith. That's quite different. To me, they undermine the creedal ground, the ground of scripture and tradition. They undermine the whole possibility of development of doctrine. They undermine the truth of doctrine. Except for in some eschatological sense, they undermine biblical morality. And see, look, the difference between schools, between Jesuits and Dominicans, that's not what's at stake. You know, so religious liberalism brings something totally different to the table, and I would suggest that although there are some good things in religious liberalism, and Vatican II picked up on some good things from religious liberalism. Let me name some examples. Some good things are like Jewish-Christian dialogue rather than anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism or hatred of the Jews um, had really plagued Christian orthodoxy. you know, so there are good things in religious liberalism. Vatican II picked up on a lot of them. Another thing would be, in my view, would be biblical scholarship. Religious liberalism points out that we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid of historical critical research. We can engage it at a certain level. We can't be fundamentalists. We can't be fundamentalists. I firmly believe this, that being a fundamentalist is not an option for Catholicism, because it's a how can you be committed to faith and reason if you basically cut reason off at the knees. I can't. You can have critiques of problems with historical criticism, but that's different from rejecting the study of Qumran and the study of the intertestamental literature, or all the things that historical scholars do. So I think that there's plenty of things that can be learned from religious liberalism. I think that Vatican II learned a lot of those things, and I think right now, though, we're dealing with a different situation where we're talking about the the undermining of the very deepest foundations of the Catholic faith. So for me, that would be like the Neo-Ranierian or the Skilbexian schools of thought. So I'm going to differentiate, therefore, between Catholic religious liberalism and then the kind of schools of thought where you have Thomism, Balthasarianism. You see, so what I'm saying is, hey, Balthasarians and Thomists, we're not. We all agree we're not religious liberals. We're agreeing on the fundamentals. Let's be friends. And so that's the argument. The argument is that, and for me, there, for all thinkers, there's plenty of thinkers hopefully listening to this podcast who are not Catholic. But look, it's a lesson, though. It's a lesson about schools of thought. So I believe that you can have different schools of thought that are deeply complementary and that share fundamental values. And so you don't have to have like a intra-confessional warfare within your church, just because like one side is analytic and the other side is more scholastic or something, or whatever. So my point is just that this is for anybody. It's a way of thinking of schools of thought, schools of theological thought within a confession. Confession being, I'm thinking here of the church. So that's what I'm pushing. I'm pushing the idea that those of us who are not religious liberals need to get our acts together. Because, by the way, it's very easy to unite as religious liberals, because what you're trying to do is tear something down. So it's easy to be united in tearing something down. It's very difficult to be united when you're fighting over the particulars. You see, but you don't have to fight over particulars if you're going to tear it down. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, you're in perfect agreement. It's like you may disagree with them. If I want to tear that building down, I might disagree. I might think the building is beautiful in some parts, and that I might have all sorts of disagreement with my neighbor, but me and my neighbor, we agree, let's tear that building down. Let's get down to the foundations. Let's tear it down. Let's dig out the foundations. We agree about that. So we're gonna have a very much a unity. But what I'm saying is that the people who don't agree with that need to get their acts together and get not fight each other and get some unity. At least that was my argument in the book. That was what I was saying in that final part. And I think that receiving Balthasar, receiving him in a proper way, does require reminding ourselves about schools of thought. That's my main emphasis here, like schools of thought. So it doesn't have to be like all or nothing, and we don't have to like sit up and count the 17 agreements we have with Balthasar, and then we list all that are disagreements with Balthasar. That's not how to receive Balthasar. To receive him is recognize that he embodies a certain school of thought, and that he has achievements within his coherent school, within his coherent vision, and to sort of appreciate him. And then we take what we want to take, but we appreciate that way of thinking, even if we don't share it. That's how you think about a school of thought that is not your own, but that is one that belongs to the Catholica. Belongs to kind of like the same confessional domain in which one lives. Anyway, you can see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I could easily sit here. I mean, I could happily sit here and listen to you for 2 hours, but let's finish up with a couple of last questions, which I'm going to combine. One being, because von Balthasar was so prolific, I think beginners can have a really hard time knowing where to start in terms of reading him. So what would you say people new to his writing, where should they start? Maybe what book or books by Balthasar himself, and what secondary sources, if any? And then second question is, what is your personal favorite book by von Balthasar and why?
Okay, I'll begin with the second question, which my personal favorite is called In the Fullness of Faith. And In the Fullness of Faith is a very short book. It's a very short book that he wrote when he wrote for one of his birthdays. He just sort of whipped it off and he gave it as a birthday present to friends when he was like 75. And now the value of it In the Fullness of Faith is in part because of its time period. Balthasar it was written right after the council, and there was the world was in chaos. Everyone was leaving the faith. All the priests and religious in Germany were abandoning the faith. There was a rise of sort of these crazy, the sort of traditionalists that were opposed to the council and in a deep way, and rejecting the council. And so they were leaving the church. People were leaving the church in all directions. And so Balthasar writes this amazing book called In the Fullness of Faith, a short book, which is about Catholicity. And his emphasis there, unfortunately, the translation can be a little bit misleading sometimes. Like he'll write sentences that says like Jesus was a Catholic, and they put it in uppercase C. So look, Balthasar, that may be so, but Balthasar was trying to get at a notion of Catholicity. In other words, Jesus had the Catholic fullness. The fullness of everything is in Jesus Christ. The fullness of everything, the fullness of God, and that's what to be Catholic. To be Catholic is to share, it's to participate in God's fullness, the fullness that he offers of himself. God offering himself to us and Christ offering himself to us. So to share in that fullness, the fullness of Christ offering himself to us, to be the bride, to really be the bride and share in the fullness of the bridegroom, in that Pauline sense, or to be the body of Christ and to share in the fullness of the head. These are metaphors, but they're obviously they're more than metaphors. but the point is of the book, it's about Catholicity, and I do think, I mean, having read, I'm writing an essay on this, but I do think that having read things by a number of Protestants, including my dear friend Jerry Walls, about Roman but not Catholic, and then also another dear friend, Kevin Van Hooser. They just have no idea what Catholics mean when they say Catholicity. You know, they think it means being, they think that Catholicity means Rome. What a disaster. What a shallow and pitiful reading of another person's faith. Catholicity means sharing in Jesus Christ our Lord. He's the Catholic one. Do you see what I mean? And so now it is true that for Catholics there is an ecclesia. We do have an ecclesiology that indicates that that Jesus really is enabling the church to share in His fullness. Now that's a dynamic sharing, though. You know, so it's not as though the Catholic Church claims now to have the perfect fullness. Catholicity is growing. You see that, in other words, that there's a growth of Catholicity. So you might say, well, how could that be? Well, like the church can be one, holy, and Catholic without being one in the fullness that it will have one. Do you see what I mean? Like the eschatological fullness of its unity. If the church can be a unity, but not yet the eschatological fullness of its unity. I mean, the church can right now have all sorts of wounds to unity, you know, and so on. Well, the same thing for Catholic, you know, that there's a certain dynamism there toward ever-growing fullness, or, you know, that really is an eschatological dimension, you know, that the church will be fully Catholic in at the consummation. But the whole point is that Catholics, you know, agree, I think, with great Protestant thinkers that that Catholicity is not about Rome. It's about Jesus. It's about sharing in the Trinity, because the Trinity is where the fullness is. Jesus is the fullness. You know, and so that's what Catholicity is. And so to me, that book is extremely wonderful book, because it sort of gives an argument for why the Catholic Church is Catholic. Lower C, lower C. It gives an argument for why the Catholic Church, and you got to remember, it's the main audience is not intended to be Protestants, of course. The main audience it's intended to be a response to Rhinarians, because Rhinarians are busy throwing out a bunch of Catholic elements. I don't know if you know, but like Protestant, like Protestant liberals would throw out this and that from Protestantism, like we don't need that anymore. Well, so the same for religious liberalism within Catholic world. You would throw out a bunch of elements like, oh, well, that's outdated. Check that. And kind of like throwing out everything and a lot of us stuff, and it's like, oh, we don't need that anymore. The church has grown beyond that. Balthasar says, wait a second, wait a second. Let's look at each element one by one and ask how it relates to Catholicity. To Jesus Christ, to sharing in Jesus Christ. And so it's a great book. It's a great book, I think, if it's rightly read. But it doesn't mean I have to agree 100% with everything he says. But it's a great book. And then you asked another question, like, how would you begin to read Balthasar, and like what secondary literature would you use? And my own view is that that a good way to begin to read Balthasar is by reading his short books. That's my opinion. If not that, I would say that you should begin to read Balthasar by reading The Glory of the Lord. Just reading volume 1 of The Glory of the Lord. That could be a good idea. But it depends on what level of theological reader you are. His trilogy is much more complicated and more difficult to read, I think. I mean, so you might start with like some like Truth is Symphonic, or you might start with Love Alone is Credible. That's a beautiful book. Love Alone is Credible. You might start with a book called Convergences. These are little short books that he wrote. And these other little short books, there's a lot of them. You might start with his book on prayer. That's possible. And anyway, these are things, and then but I mean, you notice I didn't talk about Adrian von Speyer, but I'll throw in Adrian von Speyer at the end. I don't know if you want this. You'll want this in the published transcript, but Adrian has a lot of short books herself that are very can be very enriching. And so I'm not scared of Adrian von Speyer, even though I disagree. I think that her work is very metaphorical. I think it's very much shaped by Balthasar. So himself, I think sometimes people say that Balthasar was impacted by Adrian. I actually believe it's the other way around, that Adrian was impacted by Balthasar. And of course, Balthasar wrote out everything that she wrote down. She didn't write anything. Balthasar wrote it down. So from transcripts or whatever. But the point is that that there's some good stuff in Adrian too. But in the short books, I do think that on matters, that some matters she says stuff that I can't agree with at all. But again, the principle of all or nothing is not how to read Balthasar. Sometimes people read Balthasar expecting like all or nothing, or they expect to read him like he's Thomas Aquinas. Well, of course not. You can't read that. It's you have to understand you're coming at someone from a distinct theological school, one which is really his own. He's very creative. But if you're coming to Balthasar having read Karl Barth or having read Sergius Bulgakov, you will understand Balthasar. In other words, like Balthasar is a school of thought that is shaped by a certain reception of Hegel and a certain reception of like Schelling and some others. And so Balthasar is going to have a lot of agreements with people who have any sort of German background like that. So certainly Barth, certainly Sergius Bulgakov, and because you have to remember that the Russians were reading a ton of these German philosophers, Hegel being prominent, Schelling, and some others. Anyway, so these are my basic thoughts about Balthasar, how to read him.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. Thanks for listening to the Theology Mill, brought to you by Wipf and Stock Publishers. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, you can subscribe to our show, where we have lots more content coming your way. I'm your host, Zach Mickle, signing off on this episode of the Theology Mill. We hope to see you again to share a drink and talk all things theology. Until then, dear friends, God bless, and see you soon.